Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful it shifts the way people think forever? On what seemed like an ordinary flight, a black man quietly took his seat in first class, until a flight attendant tried to move him, assuming he didn't belong. But when the truth came out, that he was the owner of the entire airline, everything changed in an instant. What followed wasn't just shocking, it was unforgettable. Before we take off with this incredible story, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments below. I promise you'll want to stay until the very end of this one. The early morning light filtered through the wide glass panes of JFK International Airport, casting a golden hue across the bustling terminal. Gate 24 buzzed with the usual pre-flight chatter. Suitcases rolling, coffee cups in hand, tired parents wrangling restless toddlers. Among the sea of travelers, a tall black man in a crisp navy suit walked with a quiet confidence. His steps were measured, his posture upright, and in his right hand he carried nothing more than a slim leather briefcase. His name was Ellis Carter, though no one around him knew that. To the passengers at the gate, he was just another flyer, another well-dressed stranger preparing for a cross-country trip. But Ellis knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, what this day meant to him. As the boarding call echoed through the speaker, he moved with ease toward the jet bridge, scanning his boarding pass, receiving a polite nod from the gate agent, and stepping onto the aircraft with the calm grace of a man who had walked that path many times before. He was assigned to seat 2A in first class, a window seat he had quietly chosen not for comfort but for the view. He had always loved watching the clouds rise up beneath him, especially on days when his heart felt heavier than usual. As Ellis settled in, placing his briefcase neatly under the seat, he exhaled slowly and looked out the window. Rows of baggage carts moved in practiced rhythm across the tarmac, and flight crews in neon vests worked methodically to ready the plane. He adjusted his seatbelt, ran his fingers along the smooth armrest, and closed his eyes for just a moment. That peace was short-lived. A voice, sharp and slightly elevated in tone, interrupted the silence. "Excuse me, sir," said a young white flight attendant. Her blonde hair tied back into a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. She gave him a glance that hovered between politeness and suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Ellis opened his eyes and looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he replied calmly, offering his boarding pass with a slight movement. The attendant barely glanced at it before her eyes flicked back to his face. "I think there might be some confusion," she continued. "First class is reserved for ticketed passengers only." Around them, a few other first-class passengers looked up from their phones or newspapers, pretending not to listen but clearly intrigued. Ellis gave a faint, measured smile and gently pointed to the seat number on the boarding pass, which read 2A. "This is my seat," he said, not a trace of irritation in his voice. The attendant hesitated, then reached for the intercom, murmuring something to a fellow crew member just behind the curtain that separated the galley from the cabin. A moment later, she returned, still unconvinced. "I'm going to have to ask you to step to the back for just a moment while we sort this out." Her words were quiet, but her posture was firm. Ellis looked at her again, this time more directly, and replied with the same calm as before. "Ma'am, I'm not moving. I've been assigned this seat. I have a ticket. I'm not causing any trouble. Is there a problem with the reservation?" The attendant's smile tightened, and without another word, she disappeared behind the curtain again. A few seconds later, she returned and muttered something to the lead flight attendant, who looked up at Ellis with curious eyes. It was clear something wasn't sitting right with them. But still, Ellis sat motionless, composed, eyes returning to the window. He had been here before, not in this exact seat, not on this exact plane, but in this moment, this dynamic, this awkward theater of subtle doubt and polite suspicion. Across the aisle, a man in a gray suit shifted uncomfortably, pretending to scroll his phone. A woman in row 1 leaned ever so slightly to get a better view of what was happening. No one spoke up. Not yet. The air in the cabin began to shift. Tension curled beneath the surface like turbulence before a storm. Ellis Carter didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't just about staying composed. It was about knowing when to stand your ground without raising your voice. The attendant returned once more, this time with a slightly sharper tone, clearly growing frustrated. "Sir, if you don't comply, I may have to contact security before we can take off." She said it quietly, but the words were loud enough to turn heads across the cabin. Ellis looked at her, his eyes steady and clear. "Then I suggest you do what you need to do," he replied. "But I'm not leaving this seat." Her jaw tightened, and she stepped away again, radioing the gate. Somewhere behind the cabin curtain, whispers and hurried steps echoed. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. Someone in row 3 began recording on their phone. The tension thickened. The entire first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what they were witnessing or what would happen next. But Ellis remained still, like a mountain unmoved by wind. As the seconds dragged into minutes, and the weight of the moment grew heavier, no one knew yet what was coming. No one knew who he really was or what seat he truly occupied, not just on this plane, but in the sky itself. For now, all they saw was a man quietly refusing to be displaced. But soon they would see everything differently. As the quiet stir of discomfort drifted from the front of the plane toward the middle rows like an invisible breeze, passengers began to take note. The interaction between the man in seat 2A and the flight attendant had lingered just a few beats too long, and though no one had yet spoken aloud, the expression said plenty. Curiosity gave way to concern. There was something about the way she had leaned in, something about the firmness in her voice and the poised, unmoving calm of the man in the window seat, that made people pause and look up. In first class, where everything is usually designed to be smooth, unbothered, and unruffled, this kind of disruption wasn't just unusual, it was unsettling. A young couple across the aisle exchanged glances, their conversation trailing off as they instinctively lowered their earbuds. Behind them, a woman in her 60s with a cashmere shawl pulled up around her shoulders paused in the middle of reading her paperback and tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. She had flown enough times to recognize tension when she saw it. And she had lived enough life to know when someone was being treated unfairly. Still, she said nothing, at least not yet. On airplanes, where space is tight and conflict feels amplified by proximity, silence often masquerades as civility. The flight attendant reemerged from behind the curtain, now flanked by the lead flight attendant, a shorter man with glasses and a receding hairline, whose nervous smile betrayed a lack of confidence. He leaned over to Ellis and asked with quiet urgency, "Sir, if you would just come with us for a moment, we can verify everything at the front of the plane. It'll only take a second." Ellis looked at him, then down at the boarding pass still in his lap, then back up again. His voice was low, steady, and devoid of anger. "I have nothing to verify. This is my seat. You scanned my ticket at the gate. Is there a system issue?" The lead attendant hesitated, eyes darting to the younger flight attendant, who offered no answer. Her arms were crossed now, her smile gone. All that remained was the posture of someone digging into a mistake she hadn't yet admitted. From row 5, a man in a checked blazer whispered to his seatmate, "What's going on up there?" The response came with a shrug. "Looks like they think he doesn't belong in first." The words passed between them like a secret, but they weren't very quiet. Ellis heard them, so did several others. And suddenly the silence of the cabin began to crack, not with outrage, at least not yet, but with that soft, shifting unease that spreads when people sense injustice but aren't sure whether to confront it. The woman with the cashmere shawl leaned slightly into the aisle and raised an eyebrow, speaking in a voice just loud enough to reach the front. "Excuse me, is there a problem with the seating?" Her tone was polite but unmistakably pointed. The younger flight attendant turned slightly, her expression stiffening. "We're just making sure all passengers are seated correctly," she said, then added, "Some mistakes happen during boarding." Ellis gave the woman a slight nod of appreciation but remained otherwise still. He had learned long ago that dignity, in moments like this, was less about what you said and more about what you didn't allow yourself to become. His silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. Back in coach, the whispers were beginning to ripple. Someone near the bulkhead leaned forward to get a better look, while another quietly began recording a video on their phone, the camera angled discreetly toward the front. The cabin was waking up to the reality of what was happening. This wasn't a misunderstanding being resolved. It was a challenge being issued. And that challenge wasn't aimed at a mistake in the system but at the man himself. Not because of what he had done, but because of how he looked. The man sitting in seat 2B, a well-dressed hedge fund manager named Ray who had been trying to pretend the situation didn't concern him, finally spoke. He leaned toward Ellis and offered a quiet gesture. "Look, I don't want to get involved, but if you'd like to switch seats, I'm happy to move, just to avoid all this." Ellis turned to him with a kind smile. "Thank you, but no. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Ray nodded awkwardly, then shrank back into his seat, folding his newspaper over his lap. He wasn't sure if he admired the man's poise or just feared being part of something bigger than his quiet morning flight. By now, the delay was becoming obvious. The intercom crackled with a standard delay announcement, blaming weather out west, though everyone knew that wasn't the reason. The mood inside the cabin continued to shift, and still Ellis didn't move. He glanced at his watch once, then back out the window, watching a fuel truck pull away beneath the wing. He wasn't surprised by any of this. Disappointed, perhaps, but not surprised. The young flight attendant was beginning to feel the pressure. She looked at the lead again, who now seemed uncertain. This wasn't going the way she had anticipated. The man wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't causing a scene. He was simply holding firm in his truth. And somehow that made it worse for her, because now it was she who looked unreasonable. She who was on display. In that moment, a quiet dread settled over her, the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, she had misjudged him. And not based on his actions, but on something far older, far uglier, far more ingrained. Something she couldn't quite name, but which was now staring her in the face from seat 2A, unblinking and calm. The murmurs continued. A boy 2 rows back whispered to his mother, "Why don't they just leave him alone?" The mother gently hushed him but didn't answer. The tension wasn't just about rules anymore. It had become a reflection of something deeper, something many of the passengers recognized in their bones but didn't know how to articulate. The subtle, everyday doubt. The invisible lines. The question that didn't need asking. Who belongs? Ellis Carter sat still, shoulders back, gaze level, heart steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He wasn't surprised. He was just waiting for the truth to catch up with the moment. And soon it would. Long before seat 2A and the murmurs of a crowded airplane cabin. Long before boarding passes bore his name in first position and airline executives took his calls on the first ring, Ellis Carter had learned how to stand in silence and be underestimated. It wasn't a lesson taught in classrooms or corporate retreats. It was learned sweeping floors at closing time in a tired Detroit diner, where the scent of grease never quite left the air, and the few dollars he earned each shift were folded neatly and handed over to his mother the minute he got home. He was 14 the first time he scrubbed a stranger's plate clean for pay. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Their old radiator had stopped working again, and his mother, Miss Lorraine Carter, wouldn't let him miss another day of school just because the heat didn't come on. "We don't make excuses in this house," she told him with a look that could pierce steel. "We find a way. Always." Their apartment was small, just 2 rooms above a convenience store where the neon beer sign outside flickered through the window every night like a broken heartbeat. Lorraine worked 3 jobs, sometimes 4, her hands cracked and knuckles swollen from years of hard water and bleach, but she never let Ellis see her cry. Not when the landlord banged on the door about late rent. Not when the old Buick broke down in January. Not even when her own mother passed away and the funeral had to be done on credit. She just kept going, like a freight train on rusted rails, and Ellis followed in her shadow. He idolized her, not because she was perfect, but because she was relentless. In school, Ellis was quiet. He wasn't the kid who raised his hand or made speeches in front of the class. He watched, he listened, and he read everything he could get his hands on. Books about business, about airplanes, about black inventors, about people who had started with nothing and ended up building something that mattered. He carried an old paperback biography of Reginald Lewis in his backpack, pages worn and underlined in pencil, and he read it during lunch breaks in the janitor's closet. where he worked part-time sweeping hallways after school. While other kids dreamed of basketball or music, Ellis dreamed of owning things, of creating something big enough that he wouldn't have to ask permission just to belong. One summer, when he was 16, he landed a job bussing tables at the Detroit Metro Airport Hotel. It didn't pay much, but it put him closer to planes. Every afternoon before his shift, he'd walk to the edge of the employee parking lot and watch jets roar overhead. It was there, standing among the smell of jet fuel and exhaust, that he made a silent promise to himself. One day he wouldn't just be near the planes. He'd be at the top of the tower. But dreams are fragile when wrapped in poverty, and even harder to keep alive when the world around you tries to extinguish them at every turn. College felt impossible. The money wasn't there, and the counselors didn't offer much encouragement. But Lorraine wouldn't let him give up. She worked extra hours cleaning offices at night, pinching every penny, and together they filled out scholarship applications by hand, sitting at the kitchen table with mugs of instant coffee and aching backs. When the acceptance letter came from Howard University with a partial scholarship in aviation management, Lorraine held it in trembling hands and whispered, "You fly, baby. You fly higher than any of them think you can." Howard changed Ellis. Not just because of the lectures or the professors, but because of the people. There, he found others like him, hungry, brilliant, and tired of being told to wait their turn. He joined clubs, studied late, interned at regional airports, and never forgot what he'd come from. Still, the climb was steep. At one of his first internships with a regional airline, he was mistaken for the janitor 3 times. Once, a senior executive actually handed him her trash and asked him to take it out before realizing he was the intern scheduled to shadow her that day. Ellis smiled, took the trash, and returned 20 minutes later with the meeting notes she had forgotten on her desk. He didn't argue. He didn't scold. He let his work speak. After graduation, Ellis turned down offers from 2 big firms to stay close to his roots. He joined a struggling regional carrier in Ohio, where the planes were old, the margins tight, and the challenges daily. But it was there he made his mark. He streamlined operations, improved safety protocols, and by 30 was named Director of Operations. By 35, he had been recruited to one of the fastest-growing low-cost airlines in the country. And by 40, after years of saving, investing, and building alliances behind the scenes, he made a move few had seen coming. He bought a controlling stake in the very airline he'd once interned for. Ellis Carter had become not just a man in the sky, but a man who owned the sky. But no matter how far he rose, no matter how many suits he wore or handshakes he exchanged in boardrooms with views that touched clouds, he never forgot what it felt like to be doubted, to be looked at like you didn't belong, to be told, in small and not-so-small ways, that your seat wasn't really yours, that you were only a guest in a room someone else had built. That is why, when a flight attendant questioned him in seat 2A, Ellis Carter didn't shout, didn't flash credentials, didn't demand recognition. He simply sat, calm and sure, knowing who he was and what it had taken to get there. He had built something, not just a career, not just an airline, but a legacy rooted in resilience. And no one, no matter how politely or firmly they told him otherwise, could move him from it. When Ellis Carter first stepped into the operations hangar at the small regional airport outside Cleveland, it didn't feel like the fulfillment of a dream. It felt more like the beginning of a quiet war. The building smelled of fuel and floor wax, the walls lined with aged safety posters, and the clatter of radios and footsteps echoed constantly through the open space. He was 23 years old, a recent graduate, full of ambition and ideas, but what greeted him was a wall of indifference. On his first day, a shift manager handed him a broom instead of a clipboard, assuming he was part of the overnight janitorial crew. Ellis didn't say a word. He swept the hangar until midnight, then returned the next morning with his ID badge and his job title printed clearly, Junior Operations Analyst. It wasn't a mistake he corrected with words. It was one he corrected with consistency. For the next 5 years, Ellis kept his head down and his vision high. He knew the business from the ground up. He'd loaded luggage, monitored fuel levels, even cleaned cabins when short-staffed. But what set him apart wasn't just his willingness to work. It was how he thought. He saw patterns in scheduling delays, inefficiencies in crew assignments, and blind spots in safety procedures that others had accepted as just the way things are. He started keeping a notebook in his pocket, jotting down observations, drawing diagrams, and proposing small but effective changes that began saving the airline money. Eventually, someone noticed. A regional director named Patel pulled him aside one afternoon and said, "You've got a head for this, Carter. Not just eyes and ears vision. Keep going." That encouragement mattered more than Patel ever knew, because Ellis was exhausted. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, balancing professionalism with pressure, intelligence with invisibility. There were meetings where his ideas were praised only after being repeated by someone else. There were hotel lobbies where he was mistaken for the driver, and private terminals where security asked to see his credentials 3 times while waving others through with a smile. And still, he never cracked. He never yelled. He never walked away, because he knew what he carried wasn't just a career. It was his mother's sacrifice, the echo of nights spent hunched over scholarship papers, the whispered promise he'd made in the shadow of airport fences, watching jets disappear into the clouds. By the time he turned 30, Ellis was recruited by Airline Airlines, a low-cost carrier trying to expand on the East Coast. Their boardroom was younger, hungrier, and more willing to gamble on unconventional talent. At first, Ellis wasn't sure if they saw his potential or just needed a face to round out their diversity brochure. But once inside, he made himself indispensable. He redesigned the hub-and-spoke routing strategy for mid-sized cities, slashing transit delays by 20%. He overhauled pilot rest schedules using biometric data, improving efficiency while reducing safety violations. He wasn't loud about it, he let the metrics speak. And slowly, the people who had once questioned his presence began to rely on his vision. Yet even there, even with suits tailored and titles that earned handshakes from investors, the doubt lingered in the air like stale perfume. One winter, during a leadership retreat at a ski lodge in Colorado, Ellis arrived early and was mistaken by the concierge for valet staff. When he politely explained he was a guest, the man blinked and said, "Oh, sorry, you just didn't look like the others." Ellis smiled, took his room key, and unpacked in silence. He had grown used to those moments, the unguarded slips, the lingering hesitation in someone's voice, the way a room paused when he walked in before the performance of welcome resumed. It didn't break him, but it never stopped stinging. As Aeroblue soared in the industry, expanding into 12 new markets in just 3 years, Ellis's name began to circulate in trade circles. He was no longer just a young executive, he was a strategist, a visionary, someone who could lead. When he proposed a new revenue model that blended luxury upgrades with budget pricing, the board took notice. Investors leaned in. The media wrote glowing profiles. But behind every accolade was the memory of a cold kitchen in Detroit, a tired woman ironing uniforms in silence, and a young boy who once stood alone by a chain-link fence dreaming of planes that could carry him somewhere better. Then came the merger. Aeroblue's boardroom swelled with new voices, and old loyalties shifted. Ellis was offered a generous severance package and a chance to take a break, a polite dismissal dressed in corporate language. They said they were going in a different direction. He nodded, shook hands, and left with nothing but a leather-bound planner and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had helped build something real. For the first time in a decade, Ellis stood outside the industry looking in. And that's when he made his boldest move yet. Using years of savings, private capital connections, and a business plan refined through every lesson he'd ever learned, Ellis Carter placed a bid to buy controlling interest in a floundering regional airline. Most called it a vanity move, a long shot. But Ellis knew the numbers. He knew the routes, the crew contracts, the fuel forecasts. More importantly, he knew what kind of airline he wanted to build. One where excellence spoke louder than assumptions. And when the deal closed and the press release went out, the industry took notice. The boy who once swept floors in a hangar was now the owner of the very sky he used to dream beneath. Still, Ellis remained quiet. No press tours. No speeches. He just went to work. He believed that legacy wasn't built in moments of applause, but in the spaces where people are watching and wondering and choosing who they believe belongs. And now, as he sat in seat 2A, the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, the silent insults. All of it settled into his spine like steel, because owning an airline wasn't just about profit or pride. It was about proving, once and for all, that he had earned this place, that his seat was never borrowed. It was built. Back in the cabin of Flight 327, the air had grown noticeably heavier. It wasn't just the recycled oxygen moving through the vents or the slight delay in departure. It was the kind of heaviness that settles in when something is happening that no one quite wants to acknowledge aloud. Ellis Carter still sat in seat 2A, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, his presence somehow both commanding and understated all at once. The flight attendant, now visibly flustered, paced a short distance up the aisle, glancing toward the cockpit and then back at the front row as if waiting for some invisible authority to validate her next move. She pressed the intercom and whispered something, her hand trembling slightly as she released the button. A hush rolled over the surrounding passengers again, not unlike the quiet before a thunderstorm breaks the sky open. The lead attendant reappeared moments later with a different demeanor this time, less nervous, more rehearsed, as though a decision had been made behind the curtain, and now it was simply time to enforce it. He crouched slightly, his voice lowered to a level that gave the illusion of privacy, though everyone within earshot could hear every syllable. "Mr. Carter," he began, voice even and professional. "We really need your cooperation. If you do not comply with the crew's instructions, we'll have to involve airport security before we can push back from the gate. This flight is already behind schedule." Ellis turned slowly to face him, his face calm, his voice composed, the kind of quiet that could silence a room without effort. "I've shown my boarding pass," he said. "I've paid for this seat. I haven't disrupted the crew, the passengers, or the flight. I'm sitting here peacefully, waiting to depart, just like everyone else. If there's an issue, I'd like to speak with the captain." The lead attendant's jaw tensed. "That won't be necessary," he replied quickly, too quickly, like someone afraid of a truth slipping through. "We have procedures, sir." Passengers began shifting more openly now. Conversations that had once been whispered turned to audible speculation. The woman with the cashmere shawl from earlier, now visibly agitated, spoke up again, louder this time. "Why exactly are you asking this gentleman to move? He's clearly shown his ticket. What is the problem here?" Her words broke the polite silence the cabin had been clinging to, and suddenly, the barrier of passive acceptance began to splinter. Others leaned forward, watching, some filming, others frowning. The man next to Ellis glanced nervously toward the aisle but said nothing. The young couple across from him exchanged uneasy glances. And somewhere back in coach, a child's voice piped up innocently, "Is he in trouble?" Followed by the hush of a parent urging quiet. The younger flight attendant reemerged, her professional mask now visibly cracked. "Sir," she said firmly, almost mechanically, "you need to come with us to resolve this. If you don't, we will be forced to call the authorities and have you removed from the aircraft." There was no more ambiguity in her voice. It was an ultimatum, a threat, a line drawn, but still Ellis didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow and said, without raising his tone, "Call whoever you need to. I'll be right here." His words weren't defiant, they were resolute. Not the shout of a man demanding recognition, but the steady assertion of someone who knew, absolutely and without doubt, that he belonged. The lead attendant stepped away again, disappearing behind the curtain with a tense whisper to the intercom. Passengers around Ellis now looked at him with a mix of confusion and growing sympathy, though none quite knew the full story yet. To them, he was still just a passenger. A black man in first class, well-dressed, composed, but for reasons unclear, being challenged over and over by the very people charged with ensuring his comfort and safety. And as the clock ticked on and the engines remained silent, more people began to ask the same question silently. Would this have happened if he looked different? The pilot, unaware of the growing unrest in the cabin, had been completing final checks when a message buzzed through his headset. He paused, listening, then looked up toward the flight deck door with a curious frown. Something about the tone didn't sit right. He handed off the checklist to his co-pilot and unlatched the cabin door. As he stepped into the aisle, he immediately caught sight of Ellis, sitting upright in 2A, his expression as unreadable as it was powerful. And in that moment, something shifted behind the pilot's eyes. A flicker of recognition, then realization. He quickened his step. The flight attendant turned as the pilot approached and began to speak, but he raised a hand and cut her off. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone professional but edged with urgency. The attendant opened her mouth, but again he stopped her, this time looking directly at Ellis. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," the pilot said, voice quiet but unmistakably respectful. "I didn't realize you'd be flying with us today." The air left the room in a collective hush. Passengers turned sharply. The attendants stiffened. And Ellis, for the first time since boarding, allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. "Good morning, Michael," he replied, his voice even. "It's been a long time." The pilot nodded, understanding more in that instant than the entire crew had all morning. The younger flight attendant's face drained of color. She opened her mouth again, but this time there were no words, only realization. She had made an assumption, a costly one, and now the entire cabin had witnessed it unfold. The pilot spoke softly into her ear, then turned back to Ellis. "We're honored to have you on board, sir. Please let me know if there's anything you need." And with that, he returned to the cockpit, leaving a silence in his wake that said more than a speech ever could. The passengers sat stunned. The tension now melted into awe, disbelief, and quiet embarrassment for those who had watched too long without stepping in. The threat had been defused not by confrontation, but by truth. And the truth had a way of cutting deeper than anger ever could. Ellis adjusted his seatbelt, turned once more to the window and waited, not for permission, but for takeoff. It wasn't until the plane finally began taxiing away from the gate, its engines humming with the low, powerful growl of anticipation, that the cabin truly settled. The earlier tension hadn't vanished so much as it had folded itself into the background, replaced now by an unmistakable buzz. Soft murmurs, darting glances, and a lingering sense that everyone had just witnessed something far more significant than an ordinary seating dispute. Ellis Carter sat motionless in seat 2A, the curve of a knowing smile just barely visible at the corner of his lips as he looked once more out the window. But the atmosphere around him had changed entirely. Where there had once been suspicion, now there was curiosity. Where there had been quiet judgment, now there was quiet awe. And for those paying closer attention, the shift was as stark as night to day. The younger flight attendant had not returned since her final exchange with the captain. She remained tucked behind the curtain, whispering with the lead, her hands clasped tightly as if holding back some unseen storm. The revelation had spread quickly. Passengers murmuring to one another, piecing together bits of the conversation they'd heard and drawing a conclusion many had not seen coming. Some had heard the pilot's words, his tone of reverence, the deliberate use of Mr. Carter, and the subtle familiarity in their exchange. Others had simply connected the dots. The unshakable calm of the man in the seat, the refusal to be moved, the grace under pressure that only someone with real power could wield without ever needing to prove it. And then, slowly, the full story began to take shape. One passenger, a man in his early 50s with a salt and pepper beard and a penchant for business news, pulled out his phone and began searching. A few taps, a quiet gasp, and then he turned to the woman beside him. "You're not going to believe this," he whispered, barely containing his amazement. "That man? Ellis Carter. He owns this airline." The words spread like wildfire. Another passenger searched, and another. Within minutes, half the front cabin had caught on. Quiet fingers scrolled through news articles and business profiles, headlines flashing on phone screens like spotlights. Ellis Carter acquires controlling interest in regional carrier Skybridge. From poverty to private jets. The rise of Ellis Carter. Aviation's quiet titan. The man behind the wings. And just like that, the narrative shifted. No longer was Ellis merely a passenger being questioned. He was the man who owned the very company that paid the salaries of the crew questioning him. He was the architect of the systems they followed, the strategist who had designed the route they were flying, the visionary behind the logo embroidered on their uniforms. He had been hidden in plain sight, not because he lacked stature, but because the assumptions of others had chosen not to see him fully. And that, perhaps, was the quietest indictment of all. The woman in the cashmere shawl, now with a slightly tearful look in her eyes, leaned forward and offered a warm, sincere smile. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I didn't know who you were before, but I do now, and I just want to say thank you for how you handled that, with so much dignity." Ellis turned to her, his voice calm and kind. "Thank you, ma'am, but honestly, I didn't do it for the show. I just did what my mother taught me. Never let someone take from you what you've rightfully earned, and never let anger speak louder than your truth." The man in the seat next to him, Ray, the hedge fund manager who had once offered to switch seats to avoid conflict, now looked mortified. He fidgeted, then cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I didn't realize. I should have—" His voice trailed off. Ellis turned slightly, offering him a firm but forgiving glance. "It's all right," he said. "You were trying to help. But the truth is, no one should have to prove who they are just to be treated with basic respect." Ray nodded slowly, the words settling in deeper than he expected. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff," the captain announced. "Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are in airplane mode. We'll be in the air shortly." The engine's pitch changed, growing louder as the aircraft turned toward the runway. But inside the cabin, something else had taken flight. A lesson, a reckoning, a long-overdue recognition of what happens when appearances are used to define worth. As the plane gathered speed and the cabin tilted upward into the sky, Ellis looked out once more and saw the ground recede, the city falling away beneath clouds that stretched endlessly above. He'd always loved this part, the moment the plane broke free from Earth and climbed into stillness. It reminded him of how far he'd come, of the diner floors he once mopped, the scholarship forms signed in candlelight, the years of silence he'd endured just to keep his place in rooms that never expected him to enter. He'd done it all not for applause, but for this, the ability to sit in a seat he owned on a plane he built and do so with quiet pride. Behind him, the whispers continued, not malicious now, but reverent. Passengers marveling at the story unfolding right in front of them. And though Ellis didn't engage with most of them, though he didn't rise to address the cabin or reveal more than what had already been seen, his presence spoke louder than any declaration ever could. Because sometimes, the most powerful truths aren't shouted, they're simply lived. And on that day, aboard that plane, in seat 2A, the man once mistaken for a trespasser sat as a testament to what perseverance, integrity, and unshakable self-worth can build. He had been invisible to some, underestimated by others, but now he was seen. And there was no turning back. As the plane continued to rise, its nose slicing through clouds in a slow, confident climb, the atmosphere inside the cabin remained suspended between reverence and reflection. The roar of the engines was steady, but it had faded into the background, replaced by a new kind of silence, one not born of tension, but of thought. Seat 2A, once the focal point of suspicion and soft hostility, had become a quiet altar of recognition. Ellis Carter, seated with composed dignity, hadn't moved more than a few inches since the ordeal began. But everything around him had shifted. People who once cast uncertain glances now averted their eyes, not in avoidance, but in quiet apology. Others looked toward him with newfound admiration, their expressions softened by realization and a subtle shame that hung between the rows like morning fog. The woman in the cashmere shawl continued to steal looks at him, her eyes thoughtful, as if revisiting every assumption she'd ever made about strangers she passed in airport terminals. Behind her, the young couple who had earlier whispered with vague concern now leaned closer to each other, scrolling through an article on one of their phones about Ellis's story. The rise from poverty, the grit of his youth, the vision that had carried him from janitor to owner. The man's hand rested gently on the woman's arm as he whispered, "He built all this. That's him. He's the one who saved the company when it was going under. And we almost watched them throw him off his own plane." His voice was low but carried enough weight that others nearby couldn't help but listen. Back in row 5, Ray, the hedge fund manager, sat straight-backed and stiff, his earlier confidence dulled by self-awareness. He occasionally glanced at Ellis and then looked away, as if the proximity to someone so accomplished yet so recently disregarded had reminded him of just how shallow his own instincts had been. He picked up the Airline magazine, then put it down again. For the first time in years, he had no words that would have sounded right. What could he possibly say now that wouldn't sound performative, hollow, or late? Farther back, in the economy section, the story had taken on a life of its own. Word had spread row by row, passed like a secret but whispered with reverence. Passengers were looking up from their books, their phones, their snack trays. They were asking quietly, "Wait, the man they tried to remove, he owns the airline?" And each time the answer came, it was met with a kind of collective reevaluation, not just of the moment but of themselves. A woman with a toddler in her lap shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable," though it wasn't Ellis she was referring to. It was the system, the pattern, the too familiar rhythm of judgment masquerading as protocol. Even the flight attendants had changed. The younger one had not yet returned to the front cabin, but the lead attendant had reemerged, now polite to the point of awkwardness. He made several passes up and down the aisle, checking on passengers with robotic smiles, his eyes flitting toward seat 2A but never quite settling there. He was trying to act normal, but the weight of his earlier behavior followed him like a shadow. At one point, he paused near Ellis and asked, in a voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Would you care for a beverage, Mr. Carter? Anything at all?" Ellis looked up, his face unreadable, and gave a slight nod. "Just water, thank you." The attendant disappeared and returned moments later with a glass, presented like an offering, the movement almost reverent. Ellis accepted it with a simple thank you, and nothing more. No bitterness, no pettiness, just grace. And that grace did not go unnoticed. The passengers had seen power before, flashy, loud, performative power. But this was different. This was power that didn't announce itself, that didn't need to. It was the kind that moved quietly, confidently, and only spoke when necessary. And now that they understood who Ellis was, they weren't just impressed. They were moved. Because it wasn't just that he owned the airline, or that he'd built a fortune from nothing. It was how he'd handled being doubted, dismissed, nearly humiliated. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't called for revenge. He had simply held his ground until the truth stood beside him. The ripple effects of that moment extended even further than Ellis could see. In row 12, a teenager who had been scrolling endlessly on TikTok was now staring out the window, headphones off, lost in thought. He'd overheard everything, and something in Ellis's composure had struck a chord deeper than any viral video. Near the back, a middle-aged woman typed furiously on her phone, already composing a post that would begin with, "You won't believe what I just witnessed on this flight." A man across the aisle was already looking up Ellis Carter's company, considering investments he'd never thought to make before. One quiet moment, one calm refusal to be moved, and a cabin full of strangers had been transformed. But perhaps most telling of all was the shift in tone. A plane full of passengers, many of whom had arrived with their own assumptions, expectations, and unconscious biases, now sat together in shared reflection. And though no formal apology had been issued, though no grand statement had been made, the energy said it all. They saw him now, truly saw him, not just as a successful man, but as a man who had shown them something about themselves. Ellis leaned his head back, letting his eyes rest. He didn't need the attention. He didn't want applause. What he wanted, and what he had earned, was something much deeper. The quiet, unshakable respect that comes not from demanding recognition, but from embodying it. And in that moment, above the clouds, where everything else seemed far away, that respect filled the cabin more completely than any announcement ever could. Behind the thin curtain separating the front of the aircraft from the galley, the younger flight attendant stood with her back pressed lightly against a cabinet, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if bracing herself against something no turbulence could touch. The hum of the engines filled the quiet around her, but it was the silence inside her that seemed the loudest now. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since the captain had walked out and spoken those words. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." She had played the moment over in her mind again and again, each time wincing at how small she must have looked. how quick she had been to challenge a man who had done nothing but sit in a seat he rightfully owned. She wasn't a rookie. She had completed her training, logged hours across coastlines and continents, recited the safety protocols until they came as naturally as breath. She had prided herself on professionalism, on fairness. And yet, in that instant, without even realizing it, she had let something uglier guide her judgment. She hadn't meant for it to go so far. At first, it had just been a flicker of doubt, the kind that rises before you even name it. A passenger boards and something doesn't quite match the picture you had in your head. You check the seat number again, look at the posture, the clothes, the expression. You wait for a clue, and when it doesn't come, you assume. That's what she had done. Assumed. And not because he was disruptive, not because he had caused trouble, but because somewhere deep inside, the shape of her expectation didn't fit the reality sitting in seat 2A. She remembered how calm he had been. That was the part that stayed with her now, like a lesson written in quiet ink. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene. He had sat there, letting her words fall flat against the weight of his presence, letting his truth fill the space that her assumptions had tried to occupy. And now, knowing who he was, she felt the sting of that moment more sharply. Not because he had power or wealth, not even because he owned the airline, but because she had looked at a man of quiet dignity and seen, instead, a disruption. She hadn't seen his history, his story, his years of earned place, only her unease with how confidently he held himself where others might have apologized for existing. She thought back to her training. They had covered inclusivity, cultural sensitivity, even implicit bias. There were modules and checklists, quizzes she had passed. But none of that had prepared her for the mirror that Ellis Carter had quietly held up. Because training could teach you what to say, how to smile, what to avoid. But it couldn't make you see the layers beneath a glance. It couldn't make you question the instincts that had formed long before you put on the uniform. Couldn't stop you from mistaking control for compliance or silence for surrender. Her eyes began to burn, and she pressed her fingers gently against her temples, not wanting anyone to see. She didn't cry easily, never had. But this wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper. It was shame. Not the kind that demanded public apology or social media confession, but the kind that settled in your chest and whispered you knew better. Because she did. She had friends who had shared stories like this, people who had been told they didn't belong, people who had been asked to move, to explain, to justify. And she had always told herself she wasn't that kind of person. She was fair. She was neutral. She didn't make it personal. But now she knew neutrality could still carry a bias if it wasn't examined. Fairness meant nothing if it came with a filter. She considered walking back out. Considered offering an apology right there in front of everyone, not because she had been caught, but because it was the right thing to do. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe fear. Maybe the awareness that no words she said now would be enough to erase what had already happened. And so she stood there, tucked behind the curtain, listening to the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversation, and the sound of her own conscience rising like a tide she could no longer hold back. Minutes passed, maybe more, before she finally moved. She walked slowly to the small mirror tucked behind the galley cabinet and looked at herself. Really looked. Not at her makeup or her posture or her uniform, but at the woman behind the eyes. She saw someone who had learned something the hard way, who had been given a rare chance to see the flaws in her reflection not by punishment, but by grace. And she made a silent vow, not just to be better in the next moment or on the next flight, but to do the deeper work, to ask herself harder questions, to stop assuming, to start seeing. Back in the cabin, Ellis Carter still sat quietly, unaware of the full reckoning taking place just a few feet away. He had long ago stopped expecting apologies. What he sought now was something more meaningful than regret. He sought change. And maybe, in that still moment behind the curtain, a seed of that change had been planted. The attendant took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and turned back toward the aisle. She didn't know if she would speak yet, or if she'd simply do better in the small ways that mattered most. But she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget the man in seat 2A, not for what he said, but for how he made her see. As the wheels of the aircraft touched down with a gentle thud and the familiar deceleration pressed every passenger subtly into their seatbacks, a quiet exhale seemed to ripple through the cabin, like a collective sigh after hours spent suspended between clouds and contemplation. The runway lights flickered past the windows in rhythmic intervals, and somewhere in the far reaches of the airport, a new day was already beginning. But for the passengers of Flight 327, this landing marked more than the end of a journey. It marked the end of an unspoken lesson, one that had unfolded seat by seat, moment by moment, high above the earth. And at the center of it all sat Ellis Carter, still composed, still silent, his presence now less questioned and more revered. Yet even in the hush that followed the landing, no one quite knew what would happen next. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the usual post-flight script. Yet there was a softness to his tone now, something more personal than procedural. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. We've arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our entire crew and Skybridge Airlines, we thank you for choosing to fly with us. A brief pause, then a quieter, more deliberate addition. And to our distinguished passenger in Seat 2A, thank you for traveling with us today. We are honored to have had you on board. The words hung in the air for a beat longer than expected, and though no names were mentioned, every soul in that cabin understood precisely who he meant. A few passengers turned to look toward Ellis with knowing smiles, while others simply nodded to themselves, internalizing the moment in their own quiet way. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the younger flight attendant emerged slowly from behind the curtain. Her expression was softer now, and though her professional demeanor remained intact, it carried with it something newly fragile: humility. She moved down the aisle, checking that overhead bins remained closed, that seatbelts were fastened. When she approached the first-class section, her eyes met Ellis's for the briefest of moments. There was no formal apology spoken, no dramatic gesture, just a look that said, "I see you now, and perhaps more importantly, I see myself more clearly too." Ellis offered a faint nod, enough to acknowledge her, enough to close the distance without further words. The chime rang. Seatbelts unclicked in a cascading rhythm. People stood, stretched, pulled jackets from overhead compartments. But unlike the usual shuffle to deplane, there was a sense of restraint in the movement today, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. The woman in the cashmere shawl leaned into the aisle and gently placed a hand on Ellis's shoulder. "Safe travels, Mr. Carter," she said warmly. "And thank you for everything." A few others offered quiet goodbyes as they passed, and Ellis responded with the same grace he had held from the beginning. He didn't need to stand taller. He was already seen. Then, just as the jet bridge connected and the front door swung open, a man in a suit stepped on board. Tall, square-shouldered, with a security badge clipped to his belt and a Bluetooth earpiece tucked into his right ear. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly, then locked onto Ellis. For a moment, passengers tensed. But then the man smiled broadly and extended a hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, "welcome home. We've got everything arranged." Ellis stood, his presence commanding but not forceful, and shook the man's hand. The attendant stepped aside quickly, uncertain whether to address him now or let him pass. She chose silence. As Ellis stepped into the aisle, the first-class passengers parted to let him through, not out of fear or obligation, but out of respect. The ripple of phones recording resumed, though quieter this time, more cautious. The scene was unfolding like something out of a movie, yet it was rooted entirely in truth. Just before reaching the cabin door, Ellis paused and turned slightly back to the passengers. "Thank you all for flying Skybridge," he said, his voice steady, deep, and kind. "This airline was built for everyone, and I hope today serves as a small reminder of what dignity and fairness should look like. Not just in the air, but wherever we find ourselves." Then, with no dramatic flair, he turned and stepped off the plane. But the unexpected twist had not yet finished revealing itself. As passengers slowly filed out behind him, more murmurs began circulating. News alerts were starting to pop up on mobile screens. A photo of Ellis walking down the jet bridge had already surfaced on a local news app with the headline, "Skybridge CEO confronted on flight. Grace under pressure goes viral." Within minutes, social media lit up. A trending hashtag appeared, hashtag Seat 2A. Dozens of travelers were already posting their thoughts. Some angry, some inspired, many deeply moved. Passengers still in the terminal were beginning to gather near the gate, asking if the CEO was really on board, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man whose quiet stand had somehow made national news by the time the plane touched down. Meanwhile, the younger attendant stood just inside the galley, staring at her phone in stunned silence, as the image of Ellis walking off the plane reappeared on every feed. There it was again, that moment of truth captured not by her, but by dozens of others who had seen what she had once refused to. She didn't cry, but she didn't move either. She simply stared, absorbing the weight of the story now echoing across the country. And Ellis? He walked into the terminal, unbothered by the eyes on him, flanked by the man in the suit who discreetly directed him through a private corridor. There was no arrogance in his stride, no satisfaction in the attention. Just purpose, just poise. The airport swallowed him into its quiet rhythm. Another flight arriving, another day unfolding. But those left behind on Flight 327 would carry the memory of his presence far longer than the flight lasted. Because sometimes, the most unexpected twists come not with fanfare, but with the quiet resolve of a man who knows exactly who he is, and no longer waits for the world to catch up. Outside the terminal's private security corridor, Ellis Carter walked with the quiet confidence of a man whose life had taught him the weight of every step. Though the buzz of the airport surrounded him, loudspeakers announcing flight changes, carts whirring by, passengers weaving through the crowds, he moved through it untouched, as if wrapped in his own current, a current built not from privilege but from purpose. The man walking beside him, dressed in the crisp dark suit of corporate security, remained respectfully quiet, glancing occasionally at his earpiece, occasionally at Ellis, but saying little. He knew better. This was not a moment for logistics. This was a moment that carried something bigger than an executive arrival. It was the continuation of a story long in motion, and Ellis Carter was both author and subject. Word had already spread. Social media had done what it did best: capture, amplify, and immortalize a single moment before the world even realized it had significance. The image of Ellis stepping off Flight 327 was now pinned to trending pages nationwide. Not for some scandal, not for a spectacle, but because of how power had presented itself, in silence, in stillness, in resistance without aggression. To many watching from behind screens, Ellis had become a symbol of everything they wished to believe was still possible. Dignity in the face of dismissal, strength without rage, victory earned not through volume but through vision. But as Ellis emerged from the side exit into the waiting black car, his mind was not on headlines or hashtags. It was on a memory. He could still see his grandmother's hands, rough from years of cleaning houses, gentle as she brushed dust off his Sunday shirt collar before church, her voice steady as she reminded him, "Don't ever let them tell you where you belong, Ellis. You walk in like you own the room, even when they swear you don't." That voice had echoed in his mind when he bought his first pair of used leather shoes for college interviews. It had echoed when his name was missing from an invitation list for a gala his own company sponsored. And it had echoed that morning, 30,000 feet above the ground, as a uniformed attendant questioned his right to sit in a seat he had paid for and built. In the rear seat of the car, Ellis removed his phone and opened a news app. A video had already gone viral. A passenger from the flight had uploaded a clip of him quietly sitting in seat 2A while the flight attendant questioned him. The caption read simply, "When dignity looks like this." The comments poured in, some praising him, some questioning how it still happened in this era, some confessing their own shame for having judged too quickly, not just on planes but in boardrooms, restaurants, sidewalks. And beneath it all, one truth rang clearer than any applause. People weren't just reacting to Ellis as a man. They were reacting to what he represented. Representation had always been part of his mission, even when it wasn't the headline. When he'd taken control of Skybridge, it hadn't just been about numbers and margins. It was about who could be seen at 30,000 feet. He remembered sitting in countless flights growing up and never once seeing a black pilot, rarely a black flight attendant, never a black CEO smiling from a magazine in the seat pocket in front of him. And so, when he had finally taken the reins, he made quiet but firm changes. He increased recruitment in HBCUs. He introduced mentorship programs not as PR gestures, but as pipelines. He changed the corporate portrait gallery outside the executive suite, no longer just a wall of gray suits and homogeneous smiles. And most importantly, he made sure that every seat in that first-class cabin was open to merit, not assumption. Now, watching the video play again, Ellis saw more than just himself. He saw a young boy in Detroit watching on his cracked phone screen, imagining for the first time that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than what they told him. He saw a teenage girl in Atlanta, her hair natural and her walk proud, saving that clip because it reminded her she didn't need to shrink to fit in. He saw an older man in Mississippi, eyes heavy with years, whispering, "About time," as he watched someone who looked like him claim space without explanation. The power of representation was not in grandeur, it was in visibility. In the idea that someone had done it before you so you didn't have to wonder if it could be done. That someone had sat in the seat, not as a symbol, not as an exception, but as a person fully belonging. And today, that power moved not just through media streams and news cycles, it moved through Ellis himself as it always had, without needing permission. The car stopped in front of the Skybridge headquarters, a sleek glass building nestled in the heart of the city. As Ellis stepped out, staff members near the entrance straightened instinctively. A young black intern, holding a clipboard, caught sight of him and froze, all washing across his face. Ellis met his eyes, offered a slight nod, and walked through the doors. The gesture said it all, "You're next." Inside, screens flashed his name. PR teams were scrambling, media requests stacking by the minute. But Ellis walked past it all, calm, steady, and deliberate, because the real victory wasn't in the trending tag or the press coverage. The real victory was in what came next, in showing up again, in building more seats, opening more doors, and continuing the quiet, persistent march of legacy in motion. And somewhere in the sky above, another plane was lifting off, its cabin full of passengers who might never look at seat 2A the same way again. The office at the top of the Skybridge headquarters overlooked a skyline shaped by ambition, decades of labor, and stories both celebrated and buried. Ellis Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the horizon where concrete met sky. This office had once belonged to men who looked nothing like him, men who had made it clear, if not in words, then in policies and silences, that someone like him would never belong here. Yet now, every inch of it reflected his vision. The framed photographs weren't of corporate parties or gala events. They were of scholarship recipients, young interns, black pilots in freshly pressed uniforms, and families boarding flights with eyes full of wonder. It wasn't about ego. It was about legacy. And as the late afternoon light poured into the room, golden and soft, it cast a warmth on everything he had built. Not just from capital, but from character. A soft knock came at the door. Ellis turned as his assistant peeked in. "Sir, the students from the Youth Aviation Program are here. Ready when you are." He nodded and walked out, each step deliberate, every movement unhurried. In the executive conference room down the hall, 15 high school students sat waiting, some wide-eyed, some trying to hide their nerves behind practiced cool. They came from neighborhoods like the one Ellis had grown up in, places where dreams were large, but opportunities were often out of reach. They were the first cohort of a new initiative he had launched, the Skybridge Elevate program. Not a PR campaign, not a tax write-off, a true investment, a hand extended to lift others across the chasm he had once faced alone. When Ellis entered the room, the chatter stopped. A hush fell, followed by the quiet scraping of chairs as the students stood, unsure of the protocol. Ellis smiled and gestured for them to sit. "No need for all that," he said warmly. "We're family here." He took a seat at the head of the table and looked at each of them, his gaze steady, inviting. "I wanted to talk to you today not about aviation, but about ownership, about what it means to claim your place in rooms that weren't built with you in mind, and to reshape those rooms so others feel welcome after you. The students listened closely, some leaning forward, some fidgeting with pens, but all transfixed. Ellis continued, weaving his story not as a hero's tale, but as a roadmap. He told them about the airport janitor job he'd taken in college just to be near planes, the hours spent reading engineering manuals in break rooms, the failed businesses before the first success. He told them about being mistaken for the help in his own boardrooms, about the time a fellow executive had assumed he was lost when he walked into a partner's meeting. He spared no detail, but he did not linger on pain. Instead, he emphasized perseverance, dignity, the quiet power of showing up again and again until they couldn't be ignored. And then he shared the story of Flight 327. Every student leaned in as he recounted it, not with drama, but with honesty. He spoke of the attendant, the assumption, the moment where silence had spoken louder than protest. He told them how every action they take, especially when the world is watching, becomes part of a larger narrative. Not just of personal identity, but of cultural change. The seat I was asked to leave wasn't just about a plane, he said. It was about how we see each other, and how we let ourselves be seen. I stayed in that seat not because of pride, but because someone needed to see that you have the right to stay, without having to explain yourself. One young girl, no older than 16, raised her hand. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, "How do you stay calm when everything in you wants to fight back?" Ellis gave her a look of deep recognition. "That's one of the hardest things," he said. "But calm doesn't mean weak. Grace is not surrender. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is not leaving, not shouting, just being there unmoved. Because when you know who you are, no one else's disbelief can define you." The room remained quiet for a long moment after that, the weight of his words settling like fresh snow, gentle but undeniable. Then, slowly, nods rippled through the students, followed by small smiles. Something in their posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough. A little straighter, a little firmer, as if they had been seen, and in being seen had started to see themselves more clearly. Ellis stood, closing the folder in front of him. "This is your runway now," he said. "I cleared the path, but it's up to you to take flight." As he exited the room, the students followed, their eyes tracking him like he was a constellation they hadn't known to look for. And maybe that was the message, in the end, that stars don't rise for applause. They rise to light the way. Later that evening, alone once more in his office, Ellis sat in the soft leather chair by the window. The city pulsed below, unaware of the quiet revolution still unfolding behind its glass towers and busy streets. He opened his notebook, a habit he'd never broken from his early days. On the first page, he wrote in clean, deliberate strokes, "Your future doesn't begin when the world gives you permission. It begins the moment you believe you belong, even if no one else does." And with that, the story came full circle. A man who had once stood outside terminals, dreaming of the skies, now sat at the helm of an airline, carving flight paths not just across cities, but across generations. The message was clear, timeless, and unforgettable. We all deserve to take our seat. And once we're there, we hold it not just for ourselves, but for every soul still waiting at the gate. And that, dear friends, brings us to the end of this powerful journey. A journey not just of one man and one flight, but of courage, grace, and the unshakable truth that every person deserves their seat, their dignity, and their place in the sky. Ellis Carter didn't just build an airline, he built a legacy, a reminder that how we treat others, especially when no one's watching, defines the world we're shaping for the next generation. Thank you so much for staying with us through this story. We deeply appreciate your time, your presence, and your heart. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of something in your own life, we would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story, and drop a comment below to share your thoughts or a moment in your life when you, too, had to stand your ground. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And by sharing it, you just might light the path for someone else. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and always remember you belong.